Hi, I'm Sarah Pearson. I'm the co-founder of The Uncomfortable Conversation, and welcome to today's episode of our podcast. I am delighted to be here today with Dave. Dave, thank you for joining us.
No problem. My pleasure.
I would love to get started a little bit with to tell us a little bit about yourself and the kinds of places and jobs that you have encountered uncomfortable conversations.
For sure. So I've been in the like bartending, restaurant, and service industry for the better part of probably about a decade and a half, so about 15 years. And then for the last 8 years or so, I've also been a tour manager. So I've also worked in live events, and I've been in and out of venues and working with musicians and in the music industry too.
Oh, I love that. So lots of different kinds of people interaction. And it would
Hmm.
sound like both one-on-one, as I think we've all been a solo customer chatting up with a bartender,
Of
or
course.
large crowds. And so, like, if you had to guess, how many people do you think, how many human interactions do you think you witness on a daily basis?
On a daily basis?
Give
Yeah, I mean, I guess
us
it,
an idea,
it
give us
depends.
a sense of like what that looks like.
Yeah, I guess it depends on the day, and it definitely depends on the environment. But personal interactions, especially if you're concentrating maybe just like on the service industry, you can have 100 plus personal interactions a day, depending on how many people you see.
Yeah.
Whether you're taking care of like a large party or bartending, people are just funneling in. It could be hundreds sometimes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I would imagine even
And
more on tour. I mean, I think in a concert scenario, there could be thousands of people.
Right. Yeah. Because if you like talk about like even passive, interactions, it could be thousands. An interaction doesn't necessarily is necessarily contingent on an actual conversation. It could be as simple as eye contact and body language. And that I'm sure in terms of body language, that's definitely a subject that we're going to kind of
What we'll cover today.
discuss a little bit today for sure. Yeah.
So I'd love to hear a little bit about, so I mean, I think going to a bar as a customer is something that, I think most of us have experience in. And sometimes I
Hmm.
think people have different kinds of bars that they like to go to. So if you're going to characterize the types of bars that you've worked at, like set the stage for us a little bit. We'll tell
Yeah.
people
So
some stories, but like to set the stage a little bit for us.
I've pretty much run the gamut, doing, everything. I've worked in nightclubs and, going home at 5 a.m. after the bar closed. I've done fine dining, steakhouse where I'm wearing a shirt and a tie and I'm taking care of whether it's, celebrities or professional athletes. And then, currently I'll still once in a while I'll work at a, smaller cocktail bar where it's just like a lot of regulars, a lot of, middle class folks where I see them, a few times a week if I'm working pretty consistently. And I know their life stories and we're friends because we exist in that environment, them as a customer and me as,
Hmm.
as an employee.
Yep.
Yeah. So I've done it all.
So one thing that we've talked about on the podcast and obviously cover quite a bit in the content for the uncomfortable conversation is this idea that uncomfortable conversations are something that can help to either create or restore safety to an environment. And so
Hmm.
sometimes we think about our only tool around making a world that's more resilient to sexual assault or sexual violence
Sure.
is to go after the perpetrators, and that the conversations are always about the perpetrators. And so I think that kind of the first thing you have to understand is what are all of the things that make up an environment and what adds safety or takes away safety. So I'm curious, if you're sort of thinking about you enter into a bar space, what are some of the things that you look for or observe that would indicate to you whether or not that space was safe or maybe not safe?
Yeah, of course. Disregarding the obvious, you get approached by a patron saying this specific thing is happening and I'm uncomfortable and this specific person is doing this specific thing. Going back to the conversation of body language, and a very simple example of that is, and I'm sure we've all seen it, when you walk into a loud bar and there's a conversation happening between two people in a very loud environment, there's two different ways those conversations are usually happening. And if it's one person talking to the other person's ear and the person listening, leaning in, letting them talk in their ear, obviously that's a comfortable conversation where that person is receiving that information. But you'll also see the situation where you're in a bar and, say hypothetically there's a male talking to a female. If it's a loud environment and it's hard to hear what people are saying, if you're usually talking face to face and the person receiving the information is leaning away a little bit, that's a very simple kind of example of, maybe an uncomfortable situation happening, and maybe a red flag, something to keep an eye on if you're a bartender or you're working in conjunction with somebody, doing security or something. Hey, if this, behavior continues or it gets a little bit worse or
Hmm.
whatever. But when we talk about body language and kind of signals that we can give, not verbally, that's a very simple thing that I kind of see all the time in a
Right.
very common environment.
So that's interesting. So I think what I'm hearing you say is, so some people might say, well, it's like, well, what do you expect? It's a bar. People just are going to be all close to each other and talking close and being close, and it's actually, it sounds like if you're experienced, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. Say a little bit more. I mean, can you think of a time that you witnessed an interaction and are you always right? So it's like, so I think, I think one, sometimes we talk about the fear of stepping in or noticing something is, well, maybe I'm wrong, right? So I'm curious if if you've had other interactions where you've had to interrupt a conversation, or how do you do that?
No specific things in terms of that context come up right now, but I already have, like, there are very very specific steps that I go through in my head. So
Yeah.
in a situation where things might be uncomfortable, I kind of try and identify who might be, on the receiving end of, whatever behavior might be too aggressive. And the first thing I try and do is make eye contact. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You can talk a lot through just eye contact. And if somebody's either, if you make eye contact and I just go, you can give a little head nod. My line is like, hey, we doing okay over here? Are we good? Is everybody good? And even if there's not a verbal, confirmation that, hey, no, I need your help, it'll be like like a little head nod or the eyes widen or something a little bit like that. And then my first step would be to, engage both of those people and not try and isolate one and immediately pull somebody out of pull somebody out of that conversation if like a physical interaction is not, necessary to like escalate things. But in terms of like involving yourself in those conversations, for me it's as simple as asking a simple question, making eye contact, and then kind of gauging what you should do, from
Yeah.
there.
That's interesting. So when you were talking about that, what I actually started to think about, I am a small female. So as if I go into a crowded bar, I see the back of the person that's in
Yeah.
front of me. And so, and so sometimes it's also
Yep.
can be hard if you're physically smaller to be able to see people that are looking at you. But I agree with
Hmm.
you. And I think I've been in that situation where even if I'm not in danger, that it feels comforting to know that like somebody has eyes on you or eyes on the situation, and that if you needed somebody, that they would be there. So even if intervention isn't required, I think what you're describing is friendly eye contact, like restores safety,
Yeah.
adds to the level of safety or comfort in an environment. But then I started thinking about because I talk to a lot of men about their experiences and how you go into a bar and you want to meet somebody, and maybe they're
Of
newer at
course.
reading body language. Maybe they haven't spent hundreds, had witnessed hundreds of interactions,
Yeah.
and aren't necessarily. So I think the other. So I was thinking about it from the others, is that if you are talking to somebody and the person that you're talking to, a lot of other people in the room are making eye contact with that person, like
Hmm.
maybe you should think about whether or not like you're
Exactly.
like you're the problem.
Is there like a concentration of attention somewhere else too? Like that could be another thing where it's like if there's something going on, and this might seem obvious like when you talk about it in the hypothetical, but especially if you like imagine a crowd setting or whatever, you can't see across, a venue or a bar or restaurant, but you can notice the crowd if there's a specific amount of attention going to a specific area. Maybe that's something to check out and you can kind of zero in on that. Or if I'm working with security, I can be like, hey, it looks like there might be something to check out over there, over there. And that's just kind of being aware. And in prepping for the show, we were talking a little bit, and I was at was actually at work the other night, and I noticed, in getting ready for this, I started to notice a little bit more about what I do while I'm at work. And one thing I always do, and this is more, I guess, like a customer service thing, but even while I'm taking care of people, or I was sitting at, having a drink with my friend last night, and I realized that, like, I'll have a conversation, but my head is always kind of like looking around the room. Sometimes where it's like so aggressive that I'll have whoever I'm talking to is like, what is he looking? And it's just me kind of, keeping my head, on a swivel. And it's just kind of a subconscious thing that that I do now, where I can kind of multitask that, have a conversation going on in front of me, and then, you know, generally what it is, it's like, we have a hostess, somebody greeting somebody at the door, and I'm just making sure anytime somebody walks in the door, they're being greeted by the hostess. But that same mentality and that same attention to detail and ability to multitask comes up in situations where, you need to step in when something
Right.
negative might be going on.
Well, it's like it's taking in the energy of the room. And I think what
Hmm.
I was imagining too, I mean, I think as being somebody who's survived sexual violence, I certainly struggle with varying degrees of hypervigilance, and which
Hmm.
may or may not actually be connected to what is physically happening in the room. But it's I think there's a spectrum of awareness that goes from being completely unaware and not seeing anything to
Right.
being hyper aware, that in a way that it's creating like a state of anxiety or fear,
Right.
but sort of what's that kind of like balanced in the middle where it's like a calm awareness of your surroundings. And you and I also just kind of in prepping for this kind of talked about one sort of area of background that you have is around martial arts. And so it's,
Hmm.
sort of martial arts, it was this idea of how you can manage energy, both mental and physical, in order to reduce conflict. And so I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about martial art training, and whether or not I see an intersection between how you're describing the way that you move through your work as a bartender and as a tour manager. But I'm curious if you see any of those connections as well.
One of the things I trained Taekwondo for about 15 years, and in learning that, one of the things, so I took it from a very young age. I started when I was like 5 until I was about 19. So especially when you're younger and you're a child coming up in martial arts, one of the great things to do is, like, you can get out that aggression, which is great for children, it's great for adults, but especially when you're a child, you start learning martial arts, you learn how to kick and punch. The first thing you want to do is you want to go home and practice on your brother or whatever. So along with that, while they're teaching you this stuff, they're also learning in conjunction with that, it's self-esteem, but also like self-discipline. And when you're increasing your self-esteem, when you're increasing your self-discipline, you're aware that you have the ability to do something. The need or want to be able to use that is kind of less. And there's always, in learning that, you learn a lot of conflict resolution, being centered yourself to try and off put a lot of energy that might be coming at you that's aggressive or that's violent. And then one of the things, like we had talked about, in prep with this show, like, I see conflict, sometimes conflict, if you want to talk about like a physical altercation or something like that, sometimes in rarer instances, it's just not avoidable. But how I see conflict is, it's kind of the end result. And we brought this up, of just not communicating up to that point and kind of doing everything, taking those steps before that. So a lot of conflict can be resolved in, taking steps of different forms of communication leading up to conflict, to, be able to kind of, get around that without it, things blowing up.
Can you think of an example of a time that you had to do that?
This is not necessarily tour management, but getting into the music industry, especially tour managing, I started to have a lot of conversations where we walked into venues where I would have a lot of conversations with people that ran venues, venue managers, stuff like that, people who were there every day. And we would end the night, we would end this 12-hour day, and I would have a lot of whether production managers, whoever was running the venue at the time, come up to me and thank me for the way that I had communicated with them throughout the day, because they say they do get so many bands that come through, and for a myriad of reasons, like, touring life is hard, things are stressful, there's substance abuse things, but they talk about groups coming in here, and whether it's the artists or the crew themselves, there is a lot of, conflict. There's a lot of, bad energy that can kind of come in, and it's just because they don't, they come in with negative energy, and it just makes everything harder. So for me, when I come into a situation, and whether it's me coming into a venue or whether it's me, resolving a conflict, one thing I'll always do is just I'll always go up and I'll meet people. I'll shake their hand. I'll say, hey, what's your name? I'll introduce myself. I'll make sure everybody knows my name because I'm actually bad with names. But whether it's like you're talking about a violent conflict or somebody getting mad or coming in and just trying to make sure, if you're working with a crew of people for the day, coming up and shaking hands and introducing yourself and, being nice and being cordial is disarming way more often than people, I think, give that credit,
Right.
for. When
No,
you
I
talk
mean,
about
it's
like
what I was saying
respect
before
and
about my favorite bystander intervention line is, "Hi, I'm Sarah. What's your?"
yeah,
It's
yeah.
because it just
And
brings
it's easier,
energy down.
in a work setting, it's obviously if you're like a patron at a bar talking to another patron at the bar and you're trying to like intervene with, a guy that might be like drunkenly hitting on a girl, you're another random guy that walks up. Obviously, the context is a little more difficult there. But when you're in a working environment, whether you're a bartender or I come in, as somebody with a person of, authority, tour managing coming into a venue, just coming in and setting the relationship like that. And I've thought about a little bit about this, the difference between like commanding respect and demanding respect. And when you come and you like introduce yourself and you're cordial, you shake your hand, you ask somebody's name, you tell them your name. That's a commanding of respect as opposed to like yelling at somebody and demanding respect of them. And when you can open up a relationship like that or a line of communication, it more commands respect. And then there's this like empathetic, mutual, respect that you have initially. And a lot of times that can quell or like cool down a lot of things that might,
Yeah.
bubble over the surface if you hadn't done that.
And to what extent do you think that comes with knowing that if things did escalate to a physical level, that you had some
Hmm.
skill or training in that?
I mean, yeah, it definitely helps. Like I said, I trained, and I don't think we said this, but I've trained I trained martial arts for all those years, and I had never been in an actual fight. But, part of, training, it was part of training, you do get a lot of that, physical energy out, whether you're sparring or whatever you're doing in training. So that's not pent up. So a lot of people so if somebody's like just drinking and they don't like have outlet to get a lot of that physical energy that's all pent up, that's generally like alcohol plus that, results in that. But when you train and you get, not only do you get that energy out, but you're also aware of what you can do, to another person. And for me it was always like, I don't want to get into a physical altercation. Number one, because you just never do. You could always get hurt. You could get something broken. It's not like, I'm not saying I train martial arts forever and I could beat anybody up. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. Because I also don't want to be in a place where I get like a concussion or I get stabbed or shot or something, ridiculous, right? But also for me, it's like if I ever was in a conflict and it got to a place of, a physical altercation, what I would be doing is I would be aiming to like maim that person in one sense or another, whether I'm like going after their knees or doing something. And then for me, it's like, I don't want to deal with the responsibility of the fact that I broke this guy's knee or like whatever, broke his nose or, did some kind of physical damage to him that I might have to be responsible for if the story or the
Right.
narrative's different,
Right.
Coming out of that. And that's what a
But-
lot of people don't
Right.
realize. It's just things I don't want to deal with,
But it's, I mean, you've trained your adrenaline response through sparring, I would
Yeah,
imagine.
yeah. And
Right. Which I think
that's a
does
big part of it.
play a role in the ability to not go into a fight mode if your adrenaline reaction is,
Yeah.
again, I think it's like and I think what we're talking about is, different moments of feeling unsafe. And so I think
Hmm.
I think, it's interesting to hear just the way that you're talking about it. Me being physically smaller, and though I, for different reasons, was for a while training on fighting because I wanted to experiment with some of what happens for me, which I freeze if
Of
I'm
course.
scared, and so it was just sort of how can I work through that feeling. But I have learned to use more I would say group facilitation skills, right? So and team,
Hmm.
is that if you're in an environment, there's a group of people, you're talking a little bit about that vigilance of scanning for danger. I have trained myself to scan for safety, right? So I scan
Exactly.
for the
Yeah.
person who's making positive eye contact, who's looking at me and looking at it at a situation that doesn't look safe or doesn't looks like it might be escalating. I think about how can I tag somebody in on my, it's like,
Hmm.
what are the skills that we might need in this particular situation, and how can we tag them in an environment? And I think sometimes we think about safety as a solo sport, but really it's a team sport. And so, kind of
Oh
what
yeah,
that
for
like
sure. I mean, like,
team building looks like.
yeah, you go out with friends, or you
Yeah,
share your location with other people,
yeah,
or you send your mom or dad or your friends a text saying I'm going here,
yeah,
or I'm going on this
yeah,
date, all that stuff. And that goes back to like about being, or that goes into like being proactive about things and making sure you don't. And again, it's like you can't always make sure you're in the best situation, but making sure you're doing your best to not put yourself in a bad position. It's like, I got to get home. I'm not going to get in a car with somebody who's, been, drinking and who's drunk. It's like putting yourself in a good
yeah,
position. And that's part of it too, to the best of your
yeah,
ability. You
yeah,
can't like predict the future, obviously,
yeah.
but yeah.
I'd love to shift gears. You told me a story about a patron that you had at a bar who got very drunk, and that there were some just kind of tricky boundary issues, that you were both boundary
Yeah.
and safety issues. And so I'm wondering if you can kind of just, sort of start the story at the beginning, kind of walk us through that story, and I'll ask you some kind of questions about how you navigated that.
So she had come there with some friends. Where I work now, it's in a smaller area of town. Like I said, a lot of regulars. A lot of people will. There's parking is not great around there, so a lot of people will walk there. A
Mhm.
lot of people just like live around the area. So this particular woman had just moved into the area from across the country. Her job had made her like hop around a lot. So she didn't, she had just come to the area about a month prior. She didn't know a lot of people. She came there with a couple of people she just met, and they had left. And at the time they left, she had, she seemed fine. She was, acting normal, and she was sitting there by herself. And I got her another drink. And sometimes when you're bar, weird things can happen where people just kind of like flip a switch all of a sudden. They can be talking to you normal. You'll give them one more glass of wine. They like go to the bathroom. They come back, and just them getting up or something, they're cross-eyed or whatever, for whatever reason. So this woman, knew, I think she, had been, the stress of like moving around, not knowing a lot of people, felt lonely, something that we all feel from time to time for a various amount of reasons. I'm sure most people who will be listening to this can kind of relate to that. And what happened is that eventually the interaction became an aggressive, like hitting on me and referencing the, my manager, my friends, genitalia, like really, where she's like, oh, you're really tall, I bet, fill in the blank. So it became this uncomfortable conversation. And I was there, closing down the restaurant. She's like, well, and in those situations, where somebody's not like in I guess danger of a physical conflict there or whatever. But in this situation, you had a patron by herself, her friends had left, and she was drunk. So immediately you have to think about turn on the empathetic side of your brain, the proactive side of your brain. It's where is she going to go once she leaves these doors, which is something you have to address legally as somebody who's had been serving her, as a representative of the establishment. You're there, is there going to be legal trouble with her leaving? But also, like, you just, that comes from a place of basic empathy. You want people to be safe. So what we learn just through casual conversation, and you kind of get these clues. Everything doesn't have to be a pointed, questioning to make sure that they're going to be safe. You are talking to an adult. You don't want to talk down to them, because that won't invite, any kind of positive interaction. But through, hey, so where'd you move? Oh, I'm just around the block. I walked here. Okay, so she's not getting in a car. She can walk back. She was asking me to walk her back, and I was like, no, I gotta close the bar. I can't walk you back. I can't go out with you right now. But at the end of it, it was, so she was, oh, I'd step away. You could see she was getting a little emotional. You don't want to, send somebody out the door drunk and like also sad if they're down on their luck. So what ended up happening is it was, she kept asking for drinks. I'm like, how about, can I grab you water or anything? She's like, well, yeah, but why would you do that? I'm like, well, we're you're still finishing that. Let's just hang out for a little bit, like have the water. But what ended up happening at the end of the night was my GM kind of walked her a couple blocks, make sure she got home okay, and that she was good. But it's just in those situations, there's always gray area. You have to kind of read it. You have to operate from a place of empathy. You have to do your best to make sure that you're just not doing anything to pour salt on the wound or make things worse, to the best of your ability. And again, this is all, and it's stuff that you're not necessarily, I think we had talked about. It's like bartenders can be like, unpaid therapists,
Right.
essentially.
I'm curious though, if you, so as you, because we talked about this a couple weeks ago, but if you were thinking about that situation, what power did you have in that situation, and what power did she have?
So the power I had in the situation was very, blunt. It would be like, I could continue serving this woman. I could aggressively tell her to get out. I can make it really embarrassing for her. If she asked for another drink, I could have a very loud conversation, or,
Shame. You had the
or be a
power
little
of
more.
shame. You had the power of
Yeah.
serving or not serving. Yep.
Yeah, I really was like a mental, emotional, and physical power over her, depending on how you look at it. Like, we could kick her out. I could make her feel bad for coming at me, sexually the way she was. And I could, you have that power, and that's why you have to kind of be like a sponge and absorb that, have a high emotional like IQ, have a high emotional intelligence and a self-awareness, because you can take that stuff personally, and it's something as a male, it's something I'm privileged to be able to do and receive that information relative to how like you might be able to receive that. I mean, in terms of like her power, she could have, she could have made a big deal out of it. As soon as I told her no once, she could have started acting up. She could have, really played the part of an intoxicated customer, that she was, but she, didn't, which, I was fortunate for, because, then I have to leverage some of the power that, I would have had. If she started making a big fuss and like throwing things, then we would have had to actually take her and, place her outside of the restaurant or whatever. But that's how it kind of goes back to like the mutual respect thing for me, which I feel like works out a lot of the times.
And if I were telling the story, so I've also been a bartender, right? So if I were telling the story of a drunk male customer making unwanted sexual, I'm assuming I didn't ask if they were unwanted, but
Yeah.
that they were unwanted sexual advances towards me.
Yeah.
And the gender roles were reversed, there'd be a very different narrative around it, right? And so I think you can get drunk and not make unwanted sexual advances to people also, as I have that conversation in different contexts all the time. And so,
Yeah.
but it sounds like that wasn't the most problematic aspect of that interaction from your perspective. Like, what I heard more of was, given that this person is making advances towards me, how can I additionally make sure that they get home safe and that they are not like at a risk of a mental health breakdown when they do get home?
Right.
And
Yeah. That's I mean, that's an interesting question. And, I've been thinking about this, but, I will say, like, a lot of the, what's been cool, particular like in the service industry, particular like in bartending, especially like the nightclub, you will run into, at least in my experience, like some of the like strongest women that I've ever worked with, because they're able to kind of absorb that and tell, just straight up tell a male like, hey, no, this is unwanted energy. Obviously, part of the of things like bartending, of course, like the context is different and the environment is different. You offer a really nice restaurant and it's quiet and it's fine dining, and you have a guy getting hammered at the bar making advances towards a female bartender. That's like you have to check that right away because of the environment. But if if you're working at like a nightclub or something like that, you also go into that as long as it's like safe and it doesn't become like physically and like aggressive and uncomfortable. You do expect some of that behavior, and you do that and you're like, well, that's part of like how I'm getting compensated. But
Right.
from
Yes.
which is and that's like uncomfortable. Like it
Being
was kind of
attractive,
uncomfortable for me
right?
to say that,
Well, I
but
mean, I think you have to talk.
that's
I
what it
mean,
is.
well, yeah. I mean, I think it's worth talking about that, right? Because in that, not. I mean, one is not all sexual advances are unwanted,
Right.
and and to some extent, I think there is something in the service industry that creates a sort of pay for flirting
Yeah.
type of dynamic, and
Yeah.
you have to, if we it I don't have I don't have a judgment. I'm just thinking, I'm just sort of thinking to myself, is like that creates an environment where, on the positive side, having like a sort of like sexual or sort of like energetic charge in an environment or an interaction is like, it's fun. It's like, it can be
Hmm.
humorous. It's like
Oh yeah.
it's one way that people connect. It's like sometimes ways people like meet each other and fall in love and live happily ever
I
after.
think and I think it's extra important nowadays with how much people are like in their phones. We
Right.
talk about like this. We're having this conversation where we're talking about body language and making eye contact with
Right.
people. And you
Right.
might listen to that and you go, well, yeah, obviously, but it's like that happens less now than it ever
Than it ever
has.
has. Right. So no wonder people are bad at it.
Freedom is important, for people to kind of bring their guard down. And then when you talk about a little bit of numbing the frontal cortex with alcohol, like that happens more. It can help a lot for people, men, women, to come out of their shells and have some interactions that they wouldn't otherwise have. But it's a fine line and it's a gray area. If you got a guy that's drunk at the bar that doesn't need anything, you can't drink anymore. He's like sweating, he's slurring his words, and he's aggressively hitting on you. It's like, okay, well, we need to unfortunately make a call, and then you let your manager, know, you call him over, and whatever.
Right. Well, and I think also is working in an environment that is, or having a group of friends or being somebody yourself who's willing to make the call early before things get
Yeah.
to, I mean, it's where we started, is in this idea of
Right.
conflict management and de-escalation, is even in those kinds of flirtation, which like includes a little bit of boundary testing of like, is this a boundary we
Hmm.
want to cross together? Like, is this something that will be fun for both of us? Is this, and there's that playfulness of it. And then, I mean, you see it too. I don't know if it sounds like you grew up with a sibling, but it's like when you have with a sibling,
Hmm.
it's like everyone's having a good time until like someone gets punched
Right.
in the face, right? And so
Yeah.
how do you stop the interaction before you're at risk of it turning into something that's unwanted for one or both parties? And so,
Yeah, like an uncomfortable small conversation to kind of check behaviors is always going to be preferable to like a full-blown conflict, whether it's screaming or like a physical altercation. A small uncomfortable conversation, or kind of like a pulling away too. You know what I mean? That's another thing. If I'm sitting there talking to that woman and she's asking me questions, or she's saying things that might be overtly sexual, it's like I do have a choice in terms of how I engage with that. And it could be, it's nuanced. It could be simple, short words or responses, or I can even if, or I can fully go in and like have that conversation and meet them there. But if I'm just like, yeah, and I kind of like walk away and I don't engage, that's another like subtle kind of like hint you can give somebody leading up to just being like, hey, you're making me uncomfortable.
yeah.
You don't have to, it doesn't always have to be said.
So as we're getting to the end of our time together, would love to do a little bit of I'm going to make this up on the fly, but we'll do some lightning advice
Okay,
and lightning round types of things. Okay.
sure.
So one thing that I was thinking of was, what's one conversation you should try the next time you're at a bar?
One conversation you should try the next
Yeah.
time you're at a bar. Are you talking about like
Yeah,
in
that's going to
terms
make it
of
better. Like if it's like, I mean, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to make bar spaces safer, more fun, better ability to meet and connect with people, fewer fights, right? So
yeah,
so if we were going to fill the bar with Daves, what's it sounds like hi, I'm Dave would be a good conversation. What's your
right.
name?
Yeah. I'm always curious as somebody who's like always, made cocktails and is interested into that. It's always like, hey, what are you drinking? Or if it's early on in the night, it's like, hey, do you have any other fun plans going on this evening? What are you up to this weekend? Or, whatever. And then I always, if the conversation, my default, if I'm going to engage with somebody and have a conversation, it's like I really get into like, hey, what do you do and what are you passionate about? Like that's always kind of like where I steer conversations, and I
Mhm.
always ask both of those questions
So what
to
do you,
see if like
if they're
those
the
two things line
same,
up, because a
right?
lot of times
They
a lot of
don't.
times they
No,
don't,
they
and then you
don't.
can learn a lot about a person right away through
Yeah.
that.
And then if you had to give three things to look for in a bar, sort of behaviors that you might want to intervene on. So you started with the somebody's leaning in and another person's leaning away. What else?
Yeah. I look at people because especially if you're going out, right? If you're going out, you're dressing up. So if I look at somebody and their clothes are disheveled and they look like they've been rolling around on the floor, it's like, well, they went out and they had dressed up and now they don't look like that anymore. So it's
Okay,
like,
something's going on.
obviously they've gone through some kind of war. And usually if they look pretty disheveled, the third thing I look for is like, well, how are they looking at, are they looking around with one eye open, or like, where are their eyes? And it's just like between those three things and that and like sweating sometimes, you can pretty much tell where
Yeah,
somebody is in their night.
sweating, droopy eyes, right? So it's
Droopy eyes, yeah, for sure.
that's another good one.
Yeah. And then like their physical appearance too.
Yeah, the physical appearance, and I think
Yeah.
one that I pay attention to is if somebody keeps trying to buy somebody a drink and they've said no
Yes.
a bunch of times,
Mm-hmm.
is that is always a problematic one.
Yeah. Yeah. If there's a guy like following around, that again might seem obvious, but there's a guy like following around a group of women, or somebody goes, you see somebody, reject a drink, say like, no, I'm good. And they walk away. And then all of a sudden, whoever was, badgering them walks in the same direction, or they're gone. You go, all right, well, is this continuing? Is it that's a sure sign of escalation,
Yeah. And what
you
advice
know?
did you have? You talked about if there's, and I'm sure you've probably seen this both in concert environments and in bar environments, where you kind of talked about and I used to experience sometimes as a bartender as well, as when there's a fight, there's like an energy that goes towards the fight. But
Hmm.
what would go in your mind in terms of, should I go towards that energy or away from that energy? I go to the door. That's where I go.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on, if I'm just there, if I'm there as a patron, yeah, I mean, it's not usually, I'm just kind of, you're staying away because especially as like a spectator, if there's something going on, the more people that are there, it's going to make it harder for whoever's going to be there, whose responsibility it is, to, quell that or solve that. The more people that are going towards it, you're just going to make their job more difficult. So if it was me as like a bystander, I guess for the, my response would be the same. It would be to, uh, if I was bartending, I would make sure, is this a situation that needs to be paid attention to? But either way, I would politely, if as a bystander, I would politely let security know, hey, there might be something going on over there. But as a bartender, it would be very aggressive, and if I'm working in a, and those situations have happened, on tour too. So sometimes like I'll spend where I stand usually when, there's a concert going on, it's side stage. And sometimes you can't see all the way back in the crowd. And the vantage point for anybody on stage is much clearer. And with a crowd, usually if there's something going on, and generally what it is, it's like a guy being creepy and taking advantage of the fact that you're all packed in, and it's a inappropriate touching and, whatever. And usually there's a lot of like this and, hey, there's something going on. There's a talkback mic on stage. And, if I can't see what's going on, one of the artists will come up. They'll be like, hey, this is going on. they'll give a description of what the person looks like who's doing it. Then you already have a direct line with security. You know where they are, so you can immediately let them know, hey, there's that. And that's, that's another reason why there's like security guards a lot of times carry flashlights, because it's, in environments that you can't talk in, you can tell a lot just by like shining a light and pointing and this and that. But yeah, it's just that, like that direct line of
It's that direct
communication.
line of communication. Well, so thank you for
Yeah,
being here and sharing some of your
thank you for having me. I
experience
appreciate
and
it.
observations, and
Yeah.
hopefully people who go to and work in bars or the music industry will learn something, and think about their environment different. It sounds like our prep conversation got you noticing things in your environment a little bit,
Yeah,
even a little bit more, and
for
you
sure.
than you already were. And so I think that's our hope for this kind of conversation, is that it sparks people to pay attention and to engage in their surroundings in ways that'll make it safer for everybody. So I really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me again.